Hello, and welcome back to our online symposium celebrating the anniversary of the Bureau of Land Management, 75 years. I'm Ed Shepard, President of the Public Lands Foundation. The PLF is the national membership organization that advocates for the retention of Americans' public lands in public hands, professionally and sustainably managed for the responsible use and enjoyment of the American public. The public lands that we focus on are those that are managed by the BLM. I've enjoyed sitting in to the earlier panels and listening to the discussions of former bosses and friends that I've had the opportunity to come across in my many years working with the BLM. Before we return to the program, I'd like to take a minute to thank those that have supported this program and the opportunity to provide the streaming service free to the public. Our thanks to the BNSF Foundation, Conservation Lands Foundation, Berkeley Institute for Parks, People, and Biodiversity, Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership, and the Backcountry Hunters and Anglers. The support and involvement of these organizations has been instrumental in bringing you this program. And of course, we also want to thank the staff of the BLM who have worked tirelessly with us to provide this opportunity. We congratulate them on their hard work and look forward to the future of the public lands. And I'd also like to thank Courtney Lyons Garcia and George Stone with PLF, who have worked hard behind the scenes to make this happen. And now I'm going to turn this over to our moderator, Elaine Brong, who will be leading our final panel, America the Beautiful. Elaine is a longtime friend and co-worker, and we share a lot in common, both having been born and raised in New England, she in Maine and me in Massachusetts. Elaine started her career with the BLM in 1979 after working with the National Park Service and the Peace Corps. For BLM, she worked in several states and in several programs, including California, Eastern states, Arizona, and the Washington office, where she was the founding director of the newly formed National Conservation Land System. Elaine retired from BLM as the state director for Oregon and Washington, another thing that we have in common. She is an inaugural member and Emeritus Trustee of the Conservation Lands Foundation, and she's also a member of the Public Lands Foundation. So Elaine, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Ed. I really appreciate that. As you can see, my passion for public lands is long lasted over many years, and my continued participation in the future management of public lands continues through the Conservation Lands Foundation and the Public Lands Foundation both. And it's been very enriching to me. I think that BLM is a very diverse, rich, and truly amazing organization to work for and to have for this country's welfare. It's complex, but it is also very exciting work to do. I'd like to just give a short word of compliment to Secretary Babbitt, who had the vision to highlight BLM's conservation mission into the National Conservation Lands Program for BLM. And being the founding member, it got me to really get involved with Secretary Babbitt's mission. And the fact that over 40 million acres has been protected in conservation for ecological, recreation, and indigenous cultural resources over the length and perpetuity. This is really a strong piece of not only the multiple use, but the sustainability for BLM's mission. And I know that if you've been following the program all day, you're probably tired. It's after lunch for most of you. So I'm just going to beg you to sit tight and wait for this, because we have an exciting panel that I want to introduce. These people have such diverse and rich involvement with public land management and with the BLM. And so I just want to introduce them very quickly, but I want them to share with you when I introduce them what drew them to their work and what excites them most about the future impact of their work on public lands. So I'd like to start with Leigh Kelley. She's a 5th generation ranch kid on the central coast of California. So Leigh, why don't you tell them all about yourself? You have an exciting background.
Sure. Thank you, Elaine, and thank you for having me today. As you said, I grew up on the central coast of California in 5 generations, and I made my way to Montana. And as luck would have it, I ended up in the Blackfoot Valley. And for the last 7 years, I've sat on the board of the Blackfoot Challenge and have got to witness the extremely cooperative, landowner-led, conservation-based work that gets done when communities can come together. And what primarily motivates me is keeping landscapes open and leaving something better for the next generation.
All right. Thank you, Leigh. We're looking forward to hearing more from you here shortly. The next panelist I'd like to introduce is Arthur Middleton. He's a PhD, Assistant Professor of Wildlife Management at the University of California, Berkeley. Thank you.
Thank you, Elaine, and thanks to the Public Lands Foundation for asking me to join. I'm excited about this. I grew up in the coast of South Carolina and kind of immersed in the marshes and the estuaries there, and that abundance of, shrimp and crabs and fish and the creeks and kind of just the abundance of life and of wildlife. And I think that experience really has always propelled me forward in looking for ways to be connected with wildlife and with other living things. And so that ended me up in a career as a wildlife ecologist and now a professor teaching wildlife ecology and management. And I think what continues to be important to me, what's become more and more important to me, is the connection between people and wildlife. I grew up having that. I know how important it is, and now I see that in a lot of the landscapes and settings where I work. So how do we recognize that, cultivate that, and then build kind of collaborations and initiatives around that and support them with science to help steward and protect landscapes. And so that's really, I guess, where my passion is. And thanks again for having me.
All right. Thank you. Looking forward to hearing from you shortly also. The next person I'd like to introduce is Laurel Harkness, who's the Executive Director, Society of Outdoor Recreation Professionals. Hi, welcome. Oops, I think
here. I got
okay,
it.
there you are.
Hi. Thanks for having me, Elaine. I'm honored to be here celebrating this special occasion. So yeah, I'm with the Society of Outdoor Recreation Professionals, and what drew me to the outdoor recreation profession was merely just having access at an early age to mountain biking in the Sierra Nevada. Grew up and in college, I pretty much majored in whitewater kayaking and found yeah, thanks mom and dad, but found my way into river guiding and was a guide for many years on the Rogue River, the BLM managed Rogue River for many years. Caught the wave of telecommuting very early on. So 20 years ago, I relocated from an urban area to the rural community of Mount Shasta, California, in the very far north. We've got outdoor recreation outside our doorstep, and it's integral to the economy of our local community. So I accidentally fell into outdoor recreation advocacy. I've worked in whitewater advocacy, backcountry skiing, mountain biking advocacy, and now I advocate for one of the most important components of the constellation that is outdoor recreation, which are the humans that actually manage recreation resources. And so that's how I got into the profession anyway. What continues to excite me and what motivates me for the future really is as I grow to understand my own privilege in my access to the outdoors and the places that I have around me, the equipment to experience that. I recognize that There's deficiency, obviously, in many communities. Most people don't have that kind of privilege or in access. And so I'm pretty determined to work with all of you, work with BLM, work with all of the partners out there to remove those barriers.
All right, thank you, Laurel. Next person I want to introduce is Justin Suraci. He's a PhD lead scientist for Conservation Science Partners. Welcome, Justin.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, thanks for having me, Elaine, and thanks to the Public Lands Foundation for putting this on. So I originally have a background in wildlife ecology and conservation, and I was drawn to that work both through sort of a love of natural open spaces and the diversity of species they support, I think like a lot of folks on this call, and also through an appreciation of the sort of growing imperative to balance the needs of people on the landscape with the needs of wildlife, and to sort of balance the growing human footprint with the need for high quality wildlife habitat and the ability for animals and other species to move across the landscape and do what they need to do to survive. And so these days, in addition to wildlife conservation work, I'm also involved in a bunch of projects centered around spatial planning, and specifically centered around the idea of balancing multiple objectives again. So in this case, conservation objectives for things like mitigating climate change and mitigating biodiversity loss. And I'm quite motivated moving forward to use this idea of science-based approaches to balancing multiple objectives to identify the sort of best places on the land for future conservation and to protect for future generations.
All right, thank you, Justin. You have a lot to show us here while we're on this panel, so I'm looking forward to that. And the last person, fifth, is Tawney, who's one of our sponsors as the president and CEO of Backcountry Hunters and Anglers, and he's a longtime partner to BLM and other wild space organizations. So welcome, Land. If you could give us a few words about yourself.
Sure. Elaine, thanks for having me. Super excited to be here today. Thanks for the Public Lands Foundation for helping put this on. The presentations today have been absolutely awesome, especially from the Secretary early, but also going through kind of the tribal presentations, as well as Mr. Cornsey and kind of the directors. Just want everybody to know I'm here in Missoula, Montana. This is the ancestral grounds of the Salish, and I think about them often, especially when I'm out seeing Bitterroots. But how I got into this, it's very typical for a lot of hunters and anglers. I grew up hunting and fishing with my family, and I was on my dad's back from the time I could, be in a backpack, and he was fly fishing. I was chasing him up steep mountains after elk before I could even carry a gun. And I was in the duck blind, watching these birds descend upon the early morning sloughs before I could even pull the trigger on a shotgun. So came to it honestly, got a wildlife biology degree from the University of Montana here in Missoula. Some folks earlier said, go Grizz, and I'll do that again, go Grizz. And then that led me to working for the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership, who is also one of the sponsors, then on to the National Wildlife Federation, and now here at Backcountry Hunters and Anglers. And so, we're working every single day to make sure that folks have access to public lands and waters and the quality fish and wildlife habitat when you get there. So it's super motivating. There's some BLM ground that is brand new that they just got from the Nature Conservancy that I hunted grouse on this weekend. There was earlier this summer, we floated the Upper Missouri Breaks with some staff. And what I love about those opportunities is they're available to all. And so what am I excited about, I think, is expanding. I think Laurel said it, expanding those opportunities and making them so they really, truly are open to all. But then also what I'm excited about is we did a cleanup, and it wasn't a Bureau of Land Management land, but it was some Forest Service land earlier in the week. We had a bunch of college kids show up. So a bunch of freshman college kids. One of them came from Massachusetts, Andrew. And, Andrew's eyes are wide open right now about the opportunities that are public lands and public waters. And I'm so excited about this next generation of conservation leaders and just, what they're going to bring to the table and the challenges that they will still have, but also the solutions that they will find.
All right, thank you very much. And you're bringing up my next point, Land, is that with the work that BLM is facing, there are some very real emerging and current situations that are critical for the future of our lives as citizens in this country, and our country is at stake in terms of biodiversity loss fragmentation of habitat, just a whole lot, climate change, fires, all of this. So I want to start with you, Arthur, if you could talk a little bit about the emphasis that BLM has been working on very recently on migratory corridors and habitat and fragmentation issues that is on the landscape due to the multiple use and human impact that continues and has been happening. And maybe you could give us some insight here. How can we reconcile the BLM's desire and needs to do restoration, conservation, with the continued demands that are placed upon it regarding renewable energy, rare earth for lithium batteries? I mean, there's a whole multitude of new needs because technology is changing, solar, whatever. And so maybe you can speak to that a little bit and how BLM might look at that.
Sure, thanks, Elaine. And I appreciate the chance to talk about this issue. I was really excited to see wildlife habitat and migratory corridors specifically called out as an early opportunity in the America the Beautiful report from the administration, and couldn't agree more that it is. I think there's a lot of opportunity kind of immediately before us and around us on it. That said, before diving in a bit to the weeds on corridors, I just want to kind of zoom out and in the spirit of some of what you just said and acknowledge the broader scope of what BLM's responsibility is, so that I can then make my pitch why this issue of corridors deserves special emphasis. I mean, just as a partner to BLM and as an observer of BLM's work, I'm just totally humbled and stupefied by the responsibility that this agency has and the complexity of the job. So we got 1/10 of the U.S. land base, and this obligation under law to balance recreation, cultural values, ecological values, economic values and opportunities, and more. And each of those itself encompasses this huge array of different kinds of activities and values and stakeholders. And so there's just so much coming at this agency's leaders and personnel all the time, and priorities coming and going. And then here's wildlife habitat and migratory corridors as sort of but one consideration in that context. I do think it's an important one, and I do think there's a lot of opportunity here. And it's partly because the world's changed around the Bureau of Land Management. So we face a biodiversity crisis that we didn't face, through the whole history of this agency, and one that science tells us, broadly speaking, can only be averted if we protect and steward enough habitat by area that's well connected enough for species to be present in diversity and abundance, and to migrate and disperse and to recolonize new habitats. And so now I want to kind of dive into the corridors issue and talk specifically about ungulate or hoofed mammal movements and migrations and corridors because they're really important. And what I hope is that even though this is somewhat of a narrow focus, that this kind of holds lessons for how we can think about wildlife habitat more broadly in the context of everything BLM has to balance. And so one of the reasons you're hearing, and the BLM is hearing so much about migration corridors, particularly for big game or ungulates lately, is this revolution in satellite tracking and remote sensing that has shown us these are more widespread, and these are really critically important to the productivity and abundance of these populations in ways that we didn't fully understand before. And so in the U.S. West, we think of like elk, mule deer, pronghorn antelope, bighorn sheep, moose, bison. These are our migratory ungulates in the West, and they're really important. And I think me and Justin can sort of fly the ecology flag here and say, these species are important to food webs. They are what lots of other species eat. They affect patterns of vegetation growth in their landscapes. And so, you know, you can think of, I work a lot in the Yellowstone ecosystem. The wildlife don't stay in that park most of the year. They move far outside of it. And we've got, you know, all of the species I just mentioned making up to 200-mile migrations out into the surrounding landscape. And those migrations to get food and shelter different times of the year are why they can be abundant. And they are why we can recover, you know, wolves and grizzly bears and have all these other predators and scavengers in that kind of system. And of course, then you think of the wildlife watching and the hunters and sportsmen who move around and, you know, leave their money behind in communities as they go to gawk at and appreciate and enjoy these phenomena and these species. And so that's sort of why you're hearing a lot about this, and I think why there's a lot of emerging kind of consensus that these are important to protect. And then on the other hand, there's the fact that they're land migrants. So these kinds of land migrants, they are stuck on the ground and they run into barriers, and they are, you know, acutely experience all the stuff we put in their way, and the ways we fragment habitat. And so you don't have to just take it from me. You can look at the International Convention on Migratory Species or the SO 3362 from the last administration, or states like Wyoming, Colorado, New Mexico that are starting to have legislative and executive action on corridors. I think the BLM can do a lot of things at multiple scales. One that's underappreciated is helping with science and learning. So in Wyoming, where I do a lot of work, that state has an immense wealth of movement data. There's been a lot of discovery about these movements. A lot of that, an enormous amount of that, is because of the Bureau of Land Management. And it's because the BLM requires developers at different stages of planning. Well, the BLM itself requires developers to know what could be impacted by those activities. And so BLM has either required other folks to study these critters, or it has contributed to those studies itself. And so even though it's not thought of, you know, as primarily a research agency, it's responsible for a ton of the research that's happened. And I think that role can continue. A lot of it's too just field folks wanting to know the resource and grabbing a hold of scientists and other agency partners and studying those. Protections, the BLM can apply some of those conservation tools to the most sensitive habitats. Citing of, you know, projects, the BLM has the ability to ask that developers and recreationists and others avoid sensitive places and times with respect to things like corridors and seasonal ranges. It can require mitigation, specific technologies. It can require seasonal closures that avoid sensitive times and places. I'd say another big one is just stewardship and habitat enhancement. I've been really encouraged and inspired by some of the work around like Cody and Pinedale, Wyoming, where BLM field personnel are really in the leadership of initiatives to do fence mitigation or removal, to foster passage of wildlife. And so I think there's a lot of that kind of work that could be done. The BLM has, I think, probably hundreds of thousands of miles of fences on its land. Some of them aren't in use anymore, others are. So there's a lot of great work that can be done there. And I think lastly, I'd just say partnership. I mean, the BLM has this enormous ability to bring energy and maybe sometimes flexibility to kind of locally led efforts built around these kinds of resources. So kind of going into the weeds on the corridor specifically there, but what I hope is that, you know, some of those kinds of actions the BLM can apply, you know, to other wildlife habitat considerations, other kinds of corridors like what Justin can talk to us about, and even cultural resources. So I'll leave it at that, but those are
okay.
Those are some thoughts on corridors.
All right, thank you, Arthur. You brought up so many points. I'm going to want the rest of the panel members to kind of integrate in terms of not only the partnerships, but the data piece, which BLM has been very successful, you are absolutely right, in getting data from the military through their satellites, or even energy company engineers who can model the efficiency of transfer of energy, so they know where to site energy projects and that type of stuff for transmission. But before I get carried away here, I do want to ask Justin, speaking of data and the use of data and what you have done as a scientist and with your organization, the Conservation Lands Foundation is really looking forward and helping to sponsor your work, making it available to other people. So if you would talk about that, I would appreciate it.
Yeah, no, I'd be happy to. I was hoping to do a bit of a show and tell today, actually, about some work that we at Conservation Science Partners have been doing, along with a whole slew of other supporting partners, trying to develop tools to aid in future conservation planning on BLM lands and other unprotected federal lands. Quickly note that this involves, as you already mentioned, the Conservation Lands Foundation, Wild Spaces Foundation, Campion Fund, Audubon Alaska. And so essentially what we've tried to do is to create a flexible tool in terms of a interactive web app, which I'm hoping to show everybody here in a minute for a quick preview, that we're hoping will help land managers and planners identify new landscapes for protection or conservation by identifying the acres with the highest sort of set of conservation values. And this work is motivated by the increasing calls from that Arthur already mentioned from the conservation and science community, noting that we need substantial increases in the amount of land protected or otherwise conserved in order to mitigate the worst impacts of climate change and also to mitigate the impacts of the current biodiversity crisis. And so this has led to ambitious goals for new land conservation. So the one everybody here is no doubt familiar with is the Biden administration's 30 by 30 objective to protect 30% of US lands by 2030. And so this is great, but there's a key sort of remaining challenge that we're hoping to at least partially address with this work, which is the need to balance multiple conservation objectives when citing any new protection. So you can imagine, so for any given landscape, the acres that might be the best for mitigating climate change, so for storing and sequestering carbon, for instance, are not necessarily going to be the same parts of the landscape that are optimal for protecting endangered species or for providing corridors for wildlife, for instance. So when doing this type of dramatically increasing the size of the protected areas of state, we're hoping that we can provide some additional tools to sort of target where these new protections would actually land. And I guess if it's okay with you, Elaine, I'll go ahead and share my screen and try to show everybody this tool that we've developed. Yeah, let's see.
Yes, that would be great. You can walk us through it.
Yeah. Okay, you're all probably seeing yourselves right now, but I will switch over to this. So this is what we're calling the Climate Atlas, and this is the tool that I mentioned, this interactive web app. And so the way that this work has progressed is that we have tried to pull together a key set of ecological and environmental indicator variables, so things that identify points on the landscape that are going to be critical for particular conservation value. We map those across the U.S. We've got a set of 6 indicator variables that address both the climate change and the biodiversity side of conservation, so things like climate resilience, for instance, looks at the accessibility of current climate habitats in the future. So essentially how far the species have to move to achieve their current climate conditions. Total carbon is the amount of biomass and soil carbon currently stored on the landscape. So we've got a handful of indicators that are associated with mitigating the worst impacts of climate change, and then also several indicators that are focused on biodiversity and protecting or mitigating against future biodiversity loss. So this is, for instance, imperiled species richness, the number of threatened and endangered species that co-occur in a given area, Ecological intactness is the degree to which a landscape stays in an unmodified state. We've got something related to the points Arthur raised about corridors. This is a broader estimate of ecological connectivity, so the ability of a particular point on the landscape to facilitate movement of wildlife and other organisms. But I think the key aspect of this work that I really wanted to highlight today is that, and what sets it apart from other efforts that I think have done similar things in terms of bringing together a bunch of spatial data sets that are relevant to conservation, is that we've tried to make an effort to combine all of this information, all of these potentially conflicting conservation values into a single coherent set of measures of overall conservation value on the landscape. So we've developed a set of index models. So this is, for instance, our composite index model, which is showing essentially taking all of those climate change and biodiversity relevant variables, sort of giving them all equal footing or equal influence in our analysis, and then highlighting the places across, in this case, the contiguous US that really are hotspots for multiple different conservation objectives. And worth noting that we're doing this work both in the contiguous US and also in Alaska, so covering, the large majority of the BLM's range. So we've got a few of these indices. This, again, composite index, combining all these different conservation values. We've also developed some models that look specifically at carbon and climate values. So these are the areas in the landscape that are going to presumably be most important for mitigating the worst impacts of climate change. Biodiversity Index looks at places on the landscape that are going to be critical to protecting biodiversity and supporting movement of species across the landscape. And then the reason that we wanted to talk to this group specifically about this work is it's our belief and our understanding that to reach any of these substantial new protection targets that Biden administration and others have set out, public lands, and particularly the BLM, are going to be really critical. So increasing current protections or increasing protections on current BLM holdings is one potential part of the puzzle to reaching something like a 30 by 30 goal. So I'm going to go back to our general model of conservation value. And one of the features of this work that we've included is the ability to overlay all currently unprotected BLM lands. So these are all the lands that are not currently managed specifically for maintaining natural land cover. And the hope is that as BLM and other federal land managers are looking for specific places to increase their level of protection. So for instance, identifying areas with wilderness characteristics and then increasing the level of protection on those, they can use a tool like this to sort of focus those new protections in the place where a large number of conservation values overlap. So to continue to sort of facilitate that work, we've built in some functions where you can essentially click on a given BLM holding. So we're going to look at, I guess, the northern portion of the Medford Grants Pass field office here. Excuse me. You get a summary of the total land area and the total amount of carbon that's stored in that land area. And you also get this numerical breakdown of the number of acres in this particular holding that fall within the top 5, 10, or 20% of all unprotected federal lands as estimated by our 3 index models. So for instance, this particular BLM parcel has about 70,000 acres that are categorized as being really high value in terms of our composite index model of ecological value in the top 5% of all unprotected federal lands. At a slightly larger scale, we've also built in some functionality so that you can sort of filter to look at just those holdings that have acres in the top percentiles of these indices. So for instance, this 10% button will show you just the BLM polygons that have really high value acres. And again, in an attempt to facilitate sort of the movement of parcels from areas that are known to be of potential ecological value to areas of actual greater protection. We've built in a few pieces of context here in these map overlays. So for instance, you can look at BLM ACECs and lands with wilderness characteristics, overlaying those with not just the unprotected BLM lands, but also the underlying conservation values and the indicators. And so we see a couple of hopeful applications for this. So one is used by advocacy groups who know that there's a particular place on the landscape that they want to see protected. Say it's one of the identified ACECs here. This application can hopefully give them a little bit more sort of fuel for their argument in terms of identifying the specific underlying conservation values that are driving the importance of that particular area. So you could, imagine going to your favorite ACEC and looking at, for instance, the imperiled species richness that underlies it, or the carbon and climate value in terms of like total carbon, et cetera. And then we're also hoping that agencies like the BLM itself might be able to, again, use this to determine which sets of lands they might increase their protections on. So I will leave that there, and I will attempt to stop sharing screen. Here we go. And would love to talk about this with anybody sort of outside the context of today's panel. If anyone has questions about this, I'll drop my email address in the chat here, and we can take any thoughts people have.
Well, you just brought up another point that I should have said earlier on. I want the listening audience to feel free to make comments, ask questions on site. It will be collected and aggregated and either sent to those individuals that have specific questions, or BLM will get the whole list of compilation of categorical questions and comments that to be considered. So I do want you to participate. And Justin, just one question for me. How soon do you think this program will be available, and how will it be distributed? Do you have a thought on that yet?
Yeah, so we are working pretty closely with the Conservation Lands Foundation, who's a major supporter and player in developing this, so they're developing a set of sort of demos and information that will live alongside the app to give users a gentle introduction to all those things that I just kind of ran through at a rapid pace just now, hopefully give people a sense of how they would actually use this work in their own planning purposes. And all that is expected to be ready around mid-October. And so they should all be publicly available by then.
Soon. All right. Thank you very much. And, I want to talk to you, Leigh, or have you talk to us. You live on this landscape adjacent to BLM and Forest Service and public lands, and have for a while. And you're also a community organizer in some sense, that participant. So I'd like you to talk to us about what that is like, what you see works well in that, environment. And what would you tell BLM in terms of how to improve that process, or what would take them into the future with that? And you can talk about Justin's data, where something like that would be helpful to groups like yourselves, or how that looks. So take it on.
Sure. Thank you. I'm always fascinated and humbled by how many brilliant people that are invested in the landscapes and the multitude of uses of what people want to see happening across our landscapes. So, like I said earlier, when I came to the Blackfoot Challenge, I wasn't exactly sure what I wanted, but I knew what I didn't want coming out of Central Coast of California with fragmentation and habitat loss and just substantial divisiveness. And what I appreciated about the community-based conservation was everybody kind of coming around the table, so to speak. And we didn't necessarily all share the same viewpoints, but it humanized the agency for sure. As BLM folks and FWS folks and TNC folks would all show up around that table, we found a lot of common ground. Maybe our kids were on the same sports teams or whatnot, but I think that helped all of us reach better understandings and humanize the folks within there. And you end up, when you're meeting in person with those folks, kind of really checking your egos at the door, so to speak. So my, just to kind of talk about on the ground type stuff, my primary responsibility is I manage a 10,000 acre allotment, grazing allotment that we run, depending on the year and the water resources, a couple hundred pair on, give or take. And currently those lands are owned by the Nature Conservancy and should be transitioning to the BLM. We also have some other smaller allotments with the BLM. And so on those landscapes, we're managing with grizzly bears, wolves, lynx, all sorts of great animals using the landscape. And when I look at our cattle herd, kind of how I see them is this massive roving movement of fire mitigation and fertilizer distribution and feeding America, frankly. And I think when I think about what BLM can do in the future is to get a little bit more invested in how we're going to continue to feed America and how livestock can be used on the landscape as a fire mitigation tool. I have to, throw in the disclaimer that there's folks that are great at their job and there's folks that aren't great at their job in every single industry. And like I said earlier, when I look at how we utilize our cattle as a tool, certain organizations we have some flexibility with. So maybe it's somewhere on the landscape that I know is primarily elk calving grounds. We can have a later turnout. Maybe we've done some prescribed fire on one end of our allotment and we would like to move to the opposite end of our allotment for turnout that year to let grass species have an opportunity to grow and change. And so I think one of the things that does make me nervous being a large allotment holder, and I shouldn't say large, we're probably pretty small in the grand scheme of things, is that when we move out of Nature Conservancy holding and into Bureau of Land Management, the flexibility becomes more difficult. We tend to put quite a few game cameras on our leases, and on those leases, it's pretty common to see at our stock water developments, grizzly bears come through, black bears come through, wolves come through, and all those patterns are interesting to see how the cattle will move through initially, and then you'll see the either grizzly or wolf next, and then the black bear's kind of the cleanup man in the back. And I think about how well all these species can complement one another when they're done well. BLM in our valley has done a tremendous job of getting some fire on the landscape in the last few years. And I absolutely know to create some resiliency for our communities. And there's been a good investment in looking at it as zones. Where do we let natural fire occur? And where do we really need to aggressively manage these landscapes to stop the massive fires, the air quality, and try and manage that to some extent. I think moving forward, I so appreciate listening to Arthur talk about habitat and movements and fence, and I appreciate hearing Lan talk about the different types of uses on the landscape. We're seeing that happen a lot. There's a lot of old abandoned fence on our landscape, and we can all easily get behind, let's remove this. So I just really think that bringing everybody around the table and having some thoughtful conversation, Justin, listening to your presentation, and I couldn't get a close look at it, but wanting to really know how you could use this to complement other uses. Laurel, I suspect you may have the same thought process of how could that be used for also folks recreating on the ground. I'm thinking, how do you prioritize some of that land acquisition with how other uses can complement it? So I think, oh gosh, Justin would be a great person to bring into our valley, have him expose that model and that concept to our folks, see what other people in the room could contribute to ways that it could be used, and then be able to apply it. So I'll probably just stop there, but I think that I just so appreciate so many people being invested in it. And that's what I appreciate about the community-based conservation is I think we can all agree that we want good things to happen on that landscape for all the species and the folks that are going to utilize it.
I could not agree more. I've worked with a lot of ranchers that, like you say, they're good ranchers, and some that maybe are a little more passive than we would like. But I've seen a lot of restoration just by the ranching patterns and the movement of livestock, and a lot of really great things that occurred way before we came along, but now ranchers are actually helping to fix that, be part of the fix for that. So I thank you. And also the community base. It is amazing to me the successful planning efforts and results when communities and people who live right there get engaged, are dedicated to make it a better outcome, and bring all this data to robust modeling that occurs. So Justin, your stuff sounds very exciting, and I bet you there are a lot of people going to be chomping at the bit to be able to use that modeling, because it will just augment what they're trying to do now. And so, Land, I'm going to go to you next, if you don't mind. And you have a lot of the same attributes and experiences that Leigh has in terms of you're living there, you're living it. You have dedicated your life to actual conservation for species in the backcountry. And you've worked with BLM, you've worked with Forest Service, a lot of agencies and NGOs. So I'd like you to speak to that also in terms of what would you tell BLM, hearing what you've heard already from the other panelists, into the future that would make them successful to achieve what they will need to achieve.
Well, thank you for that question, Elaine. I am one of the ones that's chomping at the bit, Justin, to see your research. So can't wait for that to be out in November. It looks like an amazing tool. I'd start local. I mean, I know the Blackfoot well, where Leigh is at, and that community has come around. I think first started talking about weeds and how weeds were moving back and forth, and how do we keep weeds at bay. And then we're talking about sportsman's access and how do we make sure that hunters aren't banging on people's doors every single second during the hunting season. And then has really led to, this conversation that Leigh, I think you said it really well. And I think Neil Cornsey said it well earlier. It's like this shared values. It's kind of like where you ended, is like this, this wildlife piece and then people on the landscape. And so I think that idea of starting there makes a ton of sense. And, the example of the Blackfoot Challenge is an absolutely amazing one. And I think some of the results of that in the Valley, some things that are still in the works, like the Blackfoot Clearwater Conservation Act, that will help provide some new wilderness, but also has some play areas for mountain bikers as well as some snowmobilers. And it's supported by the timber folks. And I think when you think about wilderness, timber folks aren't necessarily the first people that said, we want that to be protected. But they've sat down long enough and had long enough conversations and had compromises on each side of the aisle that I think have led to that success down there. I would say the same thing, at a larger scale for here in the state of Montana. We're looking at fire. I mean, that's one of the biggest conversations probably out here in the West right now is fire. And we had a 2-year-long process called the Montana Forest Action Advisory Committee. And in that committee, there was many diverse interests at the table. And that was timber folks, that was conservation folks, that was private landowners, that was outfitters, but it was also the state agencies, the federal agencies, so both the Bureau of Land Management and the Forest Service in particular. And so we were all having this conversation and ended up, after 2 years presenting this to Governor Bullock. And there's a lot of wonder after a new governor and a new regime took over, especially from a different party, is that going to carry forward? And it absolutely did. And so the Gianforte administration is carrying forward the recommendations, both on state lands and then working with our partners on federal lands to make sure that, we become, I think, more proactive in our fire management, which includes, some burning, it includes some forest, manipulation, and also includes some places where, you're not going to do much. And that, I think, it stood the test of time, which I think, collaboration absolutely does. And then getting even bigger, I would talk about, the kind of all the work that's gone into conserving sage grouse. And this gets into, I think some of Arthur's work, they talked about earlier in corridors. I think it gets into, specifically to this tool that Justin is talking about. But that all started with ranchers, oil and gas folks, hunters and anglers, conservationists, and government entities coming together. So my advice, to the Bureau of Land Management is finding places to have those conversations. And we already have some of those built in with travel management plans or with resource management plans. Sometimes those, though, they don't bring the entities together. Just every single entity, you know, says this is what I want on that landscape, and that is the hardest job in the world for those Bureau of Land Management managers to try to figure out, you know, how do you, you know, find a path forward that nobody's going to hate, but probably nobody's going to love. And, you know, I think that idea of bringing people together from the front end, I think is super important. You know, other advice, you know, I've talked about a lot of entities that are very traditional entities. But there is a lot of folks that, you know, traditionally maybe haven't been a part of that conversation. We had a large panel earlier that was based on kind of tribal input, whether that was consulting early or that's co-management. I think that's a conversation that the Bureau of Land Management absolutely has to address. You know, something that Laurel may talk about here in a minute is that the increase of just outdoor recreation that's on the ground right now. And you know, it's awesome that more and more people are recreating, but that also comes with impacts. And so how lucky were we with the Great American Outdoors Act and passage of that to have not only money for the Land and Water Conservation Fund, which can address some of these corridor issues and it can address some access issues. You know, we have 2 million acres of inaccessible land here in Montana. That's federal land that we need to figure out how to get access to. But the other piece of that was the backlog of maintenance. And, you know, since all these people are loving our lands, we have this backlog of maintenance. And that's there because of the increased recreation, but it's also there because we haven't care and fed these public lands. And so, you know, my advice would be to anybody listening to this as an advocate, but also those within the Bureau of Land Management, which I don't think I have to, you know, encourage them too much. But how do we get robust budgets and so that we take care of our house? And so we don't, that money, how do we get that money? And so that we don't have to worry about another Great American Outdoors Act to take care of the backlog of maintenance. Let's take care of our house. Let's take care of our car with regular maintenance. So we don't have to replace the roof. We don't have to replace the motor. So, you know, to me, it's that collaborative effort, figuring out how to work with, I would say, emerging entities, and at the same time, you know, maintain some of the traditional uses. I'll say one thing that, you know, this climate change piece is absolutely huge. And I think that's woven throughout this conversation today. And whether that's, you know, the corridor work to make sure that species not only can maintain the existing corridors that they have, but in a changing climate, how can they go east, west, north, south, but also up in elevation? I think that work is absolutely important. But the other piece of that is when we're thinking about renewable energy. You know, there was some talk this morning, and I think Laura Daniel Davis talked about, you know, there's 42 projects that are renewable projects. That's awesome. But where are they going to be sited and what are those corridors, those actual transmission lines, you know, going to be put as well? Because those can be just as fragmenting as, you know, oil and gas development or unfettered timber development. And so to me, when we think about climate change in particular, it's a way for us to come together. But we need to be careful on how we address it as well, both for I think the natural resources, the fish and wildlife, but also the people. So my advice is to, I think, create opportunities for listening, and then, you know, create more input for more people than just maybe some of the traditional people that have been at the table.
Thank you, Elaine. That was great. Very insightful also. You brought up a couple of points that I'm going to wrap up with, so thank you for that. But Laurel, this comes right to you, because the one topic that we have not discussed, not intentionally, but it hasn't been discussed, is COVID has really reawakened a lot of Americans, especially urban Americans, to the outdoors and their love and recognition that the outdoors, the open spaces, special places are very healing to the soul and to the body. And that is here to stay. And with it comes a lot of challenges for the Bureau of Land Management. They have felt it painfully in the last couple of years, but it was starting to happen anyway. And with the lack of robust budgets, as Land called it, has not helped a lot. But if you could speak to that and to your organization, excuse me, to your industry, I'd like you to speak to that, please.
Yeah, well, thank you. Yeah, COVID has definitely sparked an immense reawakening to the outdoors. And as you said, Elaine, is what was already a period of growth in outdoor recreation participation. I just for the scale of the economics of the outdoor recreation economy, the Outdoor Industry Association puts out some numbers every year, and outdoor recreation economy is at $788 billion in consumer spending and 5.2 million jobs. These are big numbers, and I think that the BEA has measured the gross domestic product numbers, and it's well known that outdoor recreation, the economy of outdoor recreation, is outpacing the overall economy of the U.S. So, with the pandemic, the outdoor gear was flying off the shelves. I don't know if anybody tried to buy a bike last year, but it was just nearly impossible. You had to know somebody to get one. Recreation sites saw astonishing increases in visitors across the U.S. I've heard numbers of like 200% increases in some areas. Definitely presented a myriad of challenges on the ground for sure. And the consensus among those of us who are in the research and the planning and the management of recreation resources totally understand that this is here to stay. This is not just a 1 or 2 year anomaly. The high levels of outdoor recreation participation are here for good. And one of the most beautiful parts of the story, though, about this increased outdoor recreation participation are the number of new outdoor recreation participants, people experiencing outdoor recreation for the first time, connecting to their landscapes, and also, as you mentioned, Elaine, a lot of urban participation, but I think even broader, it's people discovering open spaces and outdoor recreation places closer to home. So they're not traveling necessarily to go to these destinations. It's really about, what's in your backyard. So it's really a pivotal moment now that there's this broad understanding that outdoor recreation isn't just a nice to have thing. It's essential to life, essential to our health and well-being, both mentally and physically. And if you actually sort of look at the word recreation and separate that E and that C, you've got recreation. And I've heard this reference with some outdoor recreation folks that, if we think about it in terms of, us immersing ourselves in the landscape is a way to recreate ourselves. It frames it a different lens on outdoor recreation as a whole. And as Lan said, the Great American Outdoors Act really put an exclamation point on that broader understanding of the significance of outdoor recreation. It is bipartisan. I feel like a very popular person in a room representing outdoor recreation because most everybody loves it. They have a personal connection to it. It's part of their family heritage in some ways, connecting with their landscape. So we're here to stay, and I've got definitely a few thoughts on how to meet today's challenges. So Elaine, shall I just keep going, or did you have some more questions?
You have time.
Because I could ramble, but that's there's a lot to say when it comes to outdoor recreation. But I know that we'll want to spend some time with some Q&A too, I'm sure. But I think one of the main focuses for the BLM, I know, is inclusivity and how the BLM can serve historically underserved communities. And this is something, as I mentioned at the very beginning, that's on my mind. I know it's on Lan's mind. I know it's on the administration's mind too. There's a lot of policy around equity and access to the outdoors. And I think the BLM has a really unique opportunity to address this in its planning and in using experience as the compass. And to describe this a little bit better, so I think the BLM can create a framework for recreation planning and management that includes and qualifies the very specific elements that create what would be considered an inclusive experience specific to a recreation area. Think about how you feel when you feel like you're being included in a space, and that's, you feel safe, you feel welcomed, you can read the signs, you can, you can participate in the activities that are culturally important to you. The BLM, many years ago, so I have a mountain biking advocacy background, and when Neil Cornsey was the director of the BLM, the International Mountain Bicycling Association and the BLM partnered on a project around trail planning for mountain biking. And actually, so they produced a book here. So it's called the Guidelines for Quality Trail Experience. I think this is probably, reverse there. It actually is a replicable model for other planning in that it rather than having specifics on planning details, it's not what materials, it's not what dimensions, it's rather how does that experience make you feel. So I feel like there could be some advancement of that concept into the realm of inclusivity. There could be the guidelines for quality outdoor experience. That could be the inclusivity guidelines, as I think there's some very specific points that need to be addressed when managing outdoor recreation sites to make it more inclusive. And there's really, I think we'd all agree, there's no substitute for elevating the voices of those who represent and are part of the underserved communities. So I think providing a seat at the table is important, but it's got to go even beyond that. I feel like a cultural shift within the agency might be due to cultivate the development of these respectful relationships with people of underserved communities, and this involves training for BLM staff and how to engage around inclusivity, equity, and justice. And I think culturally, it'd be helpful if that work was encouraged, supported, funded, and celebrated. Another interesting concept that Australia actually has adopted are reconciliation action plans. Very interesting planning work that can be integrated into overall outdoor recreation or conservation planning. It addresses the 5 dimensions of reconciliation. So the historical acceptance, race relations, equality and equity, institutional integrity and unity. And there's different types of plans, but it holds the agency and the communities accountable in including those who have been oppressed or are underserved and have historically been so. And I think I hear there's a lot of vacancies at the BLM. I think representation is important. I know we're all inspired by our younger leaders emerging in the fields that we all represent, outdoor recreation, conservation, all of that. I think, creating training opportunities, better pathways to fill those vacancies with those emerging voices and particularly those from underserved communities would be a real win. I think we've all touched on partnerships a little bit. I've definitely got a lot to say on that. I think there's a couple of important points around growing partnerships. Well, first of all, the BLM can't do everything themselves. We've established that. They're reliant on partners. So I think that there's significant importance in investing not only in partners, but you've got to invest internally in the humans that actually help to transact and manage the partners too. I think that we're really blessed now with the Great American Outdoors Act and some significant funding coming in to do projects on the ground, but the reality is there's a lot that needs to happen internal to the agency to be able to smoothly implement those projects. And so I think that there needs to be some proportional investment in staff to be able to move those things along. I think the advocates and the policymakers in outdoor recreation are swinging for the fences right now. So which is which is not a bad thing. It's very exciting, but it's also a little bit terrifying too. So there could be, you know, significant funds coming through, whether it's the infrastructure package or, you know, civilian conservation or civilian climate corps rather. But I think for the BLM to be able to capitalize on those investments and those opportunities, they've got to scale up internally to be able to have projects that are ready to go on the ground, you know, to improve the outdoor recreation infrastructure. I also wanted to touch a little bit just on the importance of BLM to gateway communities and rural economics. I live in a rural community surrounded by federal public land, Forest Service land. I don't mean to diss on the Forest Service here, but our forests in California have been closed for half of the summer. So the economics of not having that access to public lands has been really strongly felt. And so I know that there's going to be increased pressures, you know, obviously due to wildfire to keep recreation areas open. But I think, you know, this is going to be a challenge. And I think having partnerships and collaborative management is going to help, you know, achieve those things. So,
and gateway communities are instrumental in helping that happen.
Right. I've seen some really wonderful partnerships like what you guys have described up in the Bitterroot too, in California, other in Colorado, other parts of the country too, where there's continuity in the partnership from the federal level all the way down to the local government level. So, you know, and with these rural communities in particular, there's universally a low capacity in the organizations. It's a lot of volunteer-based organizations that are doing all the work on the ground, and there's turnover at the local government level. So having a living and breathing and well-fed and cared for collaborative or a partnership can pay dividends in the end. You know, if there's real common objectives around outdoor recreation and conservation, there's accountability, everybody knows who's doing what, there's no surprises. And, you know, I think, you know, investments in landscape level planning is really important. Fire doesn't know jurisdictions. People tend not to know jurisdictions either. And cattle, wildlife. So I think that those collaboratives can really cultivate some good investments that can have some great recreation outcomes too. I'll leave it there and hand it back to you, Elaine. And I know this has been a great discussion, so thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your comments. They were very helpful. And I just want to ask the panelists if they have any summary comment or any other comments you'd like to make or question to each other. I know you're not shy. Well, I just would like to summarize just a little bit on some comments that you all made. And one of them is, since you were last, Laurel, I'm going to pick on you first, but you know, the BLM does have an opportunity. There are so many vacancies, which is a curse, but it's also a blessing in terms of bringing either professions, specialties, skills that are needed for the future versus what was in the past. And I am an example of that. Since I came into the Bureau, we called it the FLPMA babies. And when FLPMA passed in the 70s with its multiple use and sustained yield act, it also came with NEPA, newly passed laws, and NEPA, clean water, wilderness, all of those things. And the BLM did not have the professions nor the employees to do the work that was being required. And I think this is another era of that. Climate change, a lot of the issues we've all talked about, fire, whatever, has placed a really urgent demand on the BLM's performance. And there is an opportunity for access. Access on so many levels is, Public Lands Foundation spends a lot of its time discussing lack of access, inability to access, Same thing as you mentioned, totally enclosed lands that need to be opened up for access. So there is an opportunity here for the BLM. The other thing that I've had conversations with a colleague of mine, Jim Ken, I'm going to say his name, about the fact that the multiple use, the FLPMA under multiple use and sustained yield has some very strong authorizations and legal abilities for the BLM to move as it has and has evolved over time. And I think if the BLM and the Secretary could look at this mission statement of sustained yield with the filters of climate change, fires, access, recreation. I know the administration is looking at performance-based permitting for livestock ranchers, which is a real plus in terms of ranchers who are doing the right thing and trying to do right by the land. That would be very helpful to them. And so there are some capabilities there, but I do want to challenge the Secretary and the BLM Director to look at its authorities. One thing that FLPMA also did, it eliminated 3,500 antiquated or duplicate laws that were on the books for BLM. And so if there are some things that legal barriers that would cause BLM from moving forward in the direction that it needs to for the future, that should be looked at and get Congress as a partner to help eliminate some of those barriers or create new legislation to augment the speed at which BLM needs to act. And there is a lot of leadership that will be needed for the future movement. And I think those leaders are there. And I think there is a lot of great opportunity to take that on. You've heard, if you listened to the discussions earlier and even in our discussion, BLM has so many things coming at it that it is almost impossible to take it all in. But I think if the administration just looked at 2 to 3 major critical pieces to move forward and act on those while the agency does the day-to-day work, that would be a great movement forward instead of being mired up. And there are some thoughts there. You all brought it up. Funding structure, is it appropriate? Is it being disseminated from Congress and designed in the right format to move forward? The organizational structure, is it appropriate as it was 50 years ago? Maybe they need to look at, though I am not a proponent of reorganizations. So, because you get mired up into a lot of wasted time, but looking futuristically at how the organization is organized and with other agencies and other entities, the partnerships, how are employees able to work seamlessly throughout all of this with the challenges that they have? That might be worth it. The administration is already moving forward with our panel at the America the Beautiful initiative. They're supporting the Climate Conservation Corps. Partnership Act is moving ahead. There's a Renewable Energy Coordinating Office that's been established or being established to help move that effort forward. They're looking at headquarter positions, what is appropriate in DC and what is appropriate out west. And that, I think, would really bode well if they could put that one to rest. And I think that the Secretary and the acting or the Deputy Director, Nada, are doing a really great job right now to help move BLM forward. It's an amazing agency with an amazing challenge and program and mission. And the tribes, along with BLM, I think can really help move things really forward, and the partnerships of the communities and entities that we need to continue to grow and really help sponsor and support. And so if anybody has any last minute thoughts or comments, I would invite you to say them now.
Yeah, I think we're all on the same team, Elaine, and you know, listening to everybody's presentations and kind of looking at Justin's work and the mapping and knowing how we can integrate and leverage technology and look at those layers and really understand how to be efficient, you know, in how we move forward. But I think we're all trying to achieve the same goals and have it be sustainable and plan like Neil Cornsey said, you know, we've got to be thinking 200 years ahead of us. So.
Right. And not just the next 50 years, but way beyond in terms of, and I do invite the listeners to submit 1 or 2 thoughts that you might have that would make BLM successful in that next 100 years, because we all know, I mean, all of you are really supportive and proponents of public lands. We will need it. We will need all the help and work. And I think it's very exciting because there are a lot of capable people, especially on this panel. And I thank you very much, all of you, for taking time out of your busy days to be here and share your stories and your thoughts and ideas with everyone during this celebration of 75 years. Lan, you have a question?
Well, I just have like a last comment is that,
Okay.
you know, we're super lucky to have the public lands and public waters we do in this country. And none of that happened by accident. You know, we're celebrating 75 years of the Bureau of Land Management, the probably least known agency that actually is the largest, you know, 245 million acres that is available to us in many different ways. So I guess, you know, I don't have to say this to the people on the panel, but people that are listening, I mean, this world is run by those who show up. And so the reason why we have what we have today on our Bureau of Land Management lands and like this tool that Justin is putting together, it's going to be those who take that tool and then show up and ask for, you know, things at the table. And so to me, like I think Laurel just said, I think a lot of us are on the same page, but man, do we have to show up? And you know, if we don't, then somebody else is going to show up. And so, you know, as we look forward, you know, again, this world is run by those that do. And so I just would encourage everybody that's listening to this to encourage your memberships, to encourage your fellow colleagues, that we have to show up to make, I think, to create a BLM that is there for, you know, 200 more years, or is there to serve, you know, new people. But that happens because people make it that way, not that it just happens on its own.
Absolutely. So Arthur, did you have a comment?
No, just I couldn't agree more with Land, and just want to thank Elaine, you and the Public Lands Foundation and the sponsors and co-hosts for having us.
You're welcome. It's been a great panel. I thank you very much, and good luck to BLM. And you're right, we all need to be there and be committed, and we need to wake up our communities to be there. So thank you for that, Land, and thank you, BLM. I guess we'll end this panel now.
Thanks so much, all of you, and thanks everyone for joining us today. It's been a day of perspectives on BLM and public lands, and you know, a lot of great conversations, some beginning, some continuing, but I think we'll be continuing and building on those for quite some time. You know, we heard a lot about people's different connections to public lands, and you've all identified a lot of challenges for us, but also vision for new directions. You know, we heard from the Secretary of the Interior and Laura Daniel Davis, or from the Assistant Secretary for Land and Minerals Office, and Holly DeRemus about their visions. Some really specific ideas about how to change our direction from the first panel and the third panel on tribal leadership and co-management and America the Beautiful. And, you know, listening to this, I really appreciate the support for the BLM and your faith in us to rise to these challenges. You know, I think it's great to hear about how we can do a better job of honoring tribal stewardship and better support local communities through conservation, like America the Beautiful, and also, you know, how empowered BLM actually is to address both the threats and opportunities from climate change. And I think we've heard a lot about how we need to evolve along with our country and the planet as we adapt our multiple use and sustained yield mission, and that too will be evolving. So I wanted to thank you for all of the input today. I think we should have called this symposium the One Giant Suggestion Box. So we really appreciate all of those thoughts, and we're looking forward to celebrating Public Lands Day this weekend, continuing to celebrate our anniversary, and continuing to celebrate these very frank conversations with all of you. So thanks for showing up and continuing to show up with us, and looking forward to continuing it all. So thanks so much. And thanks again to the folks that made this symposium happen, and for all the panelists. It's just been a great day. So hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and thanks again.